Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Here we are back studying Rashi together for the first time in quite a long time. I sent an email out last night reminding everybody that we were starting up again, but I just checked and for some reason it never got sent. It's still in my draft, so I feel bad about that. I hope that there's nobody who was not aware that we were meeting today, but there might be. So Moadim L'Simcha, we have most of the tech that we normally have in Pilch, and I say normally because we've only done it about 3 or 4 times since we came back doing it in person, but it means that the people who are in person cannot see the people who are on Zoom, but hopefully the people who are on Zoom can hear the people who are in person because we'll move the microphone around, okay? And let's get right into it. I did not have a proper mark in my chumash as to where we stopped off last time. I think I know where we are, but if one of you has a better indication of it, you'll let me know. I believe, and it's going to take us we're going to read a few verses just to get us back into the rhythm, but I believe we're about to read verse 4 of chapter 6 of the book of Shemot. So I said that backwards. Shemot, chapter 6, verse 4. Which means that we're just in the 3rd verse of Parshat Va'era, the 2nd Parsha in the book of Shemot. And just to remind us what's going on, right? We read the Rashi on 4? Oh, right, because we read a few verses because the Rashi's kind of all string together, and we read the first Rashi on verse 4. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of Chazarah so that it's familiar what's happening. If you remind yourself how Parshat Shemot ended just a few verses ago, and again, according to the Christian division of the texts, this is all one chapter. The end of the Parshat Shemot, the beginning of Parshat Va'era, same chapter. We, the Jews, make a strong distinction at the end of the Parshat Shemot. That last verse in Parshat Shemot, which was 6:1 of Exodus, Vayomer Adonai al Moshe, God said to Moses, Ata tira, now you will see, Asher eseh leFaro, that which I will do to Pharaoh, Ki biyad chazaka yishalchem, because with a strong hand he will send them. We discussed, is that Pharaoh's strong hand or is that God's strong hand? Ubiyad chazaka yigarshem mi'artzo, and with a strong hand he will expel them from his land. That's how Parshat Shemot ended. And then we have a whole week in between those parshas, but in the Torah itself, which is the next verse, the first verse of the book of Parshat Va'era, Vaydaber Elohim al Moshe, a different name of God, Elohim spoke to Moshe, Vayomer Elav, and said to him, Ani Adonai. We spent a long time on that. What does it mean that the God named Elohim introduces God's self as Adonai to Moshe? And God says, Va'era el Abraham el Yitzchak el Yaakov el Shaddai. Hey, when I revealed myself to your ancestors, it was to El Shaddai. We discussed how that you can find many verses where Yud Hey Vav Hey appears with respect to those early ancestors, even though the Torah says here, Ushmi Adonai lo nodati lehem, and the name of God I did not make known to them. Rashi says there's a difference between nodati and hodati. Hodati means, yes, they heard the name. Nodati means they weren't made fully aware of what it means to be in a relationship with the God who's Yud Hey Vav Hey. That brings us to verse 4, which we've done half the Rashis on. Let me just read verse 4 and 5 out loud, and then we'll go back to the Rashis. A continuation of what Moshe is hearing from God. V'gam hakimotiet britim itam. And now, or and yet, something like that, I have established, or I will establish my covenant with them. Latet lahem et eretz Canaan, to give them the land of Canaan. Et eretz mugurehem asher garuva. Either the et here means along with, or it means a continuation of the direct object, the land of their wanderings which they journeyed in. We spent a lot of time discussing what that Mugurei Asher Garuba means. And then verse 5, all is right in the world that Leonard's showing up with a V8. I've missed that Wednesday morning view. Welcome back, Leonard, in your V8. V'gam ani shamati et nakat b'nei Israel. And also I have heard, God says, at nakat, the groans of the children of Israel. Asher Mitzrayim Ma'avidim Otam. It's kind of a slightly truncated phrase. the groans because, or based on the fact that the Egyptians are ma'avidim otam, are working them hard. Va ezkor et briti, and I have remembered my covenant. Okay, so all that is chazarah. We read verses 4 and 5 together way back when, because the Rashis on verse 4 kind of assume that we know the verses coming after that. And the question that Rashi is playing with in verse 4 is, what is the relationship between, on the one hand, God saying, I never revealed myself fully to them the way I have to you. They never really got the full impact of Yud Hey Vav Hey. And yet I was beholden to them for some covenant that I promised, right? Because the whole notion of my not having revealed myself to them with Yud Hey Vav Hey says that it was not as an intimate of a connection. It was not as personal one. And yet I made a promise to them, and here I am fulfilling that promise. So, questions or comments? I know that was quick review. Where are we? Chapter 6 of Shemot, we're about to do the Rashis on verse 4. First few verses of Parshat Va'era. Is the sound okay? Barbara, you can hear me? Joanna, Rick, you can hear me? Okay. Okay, Moedim L'Simcha to everyone, and as Rabbi Lucas would say, Chaguzel, which is the abbreviation of Chagim Uzmanim L'Sason. Okay. V'gam hakimoti et briti. So everyone see where we are, the first Rashi in verse 4, which I guess is the last Rashi that we did. Rashi says, and then at some point I'll call on a reader, but I just want to get us back to where we were. Gam kshenireti lehem be'el Shaddai, even when I was making myself known to them by El Shaddai, which means what by inference? Given what we just learned, when God says, in Rashi's view, even though I was kind of revealing myself to them as El Shaddai and not what? Not Adonai. Even though it was a partial revelation, it was a limited revelation, it was a circumscribed revelation, even though it was not as intimate as it is with Yud Hey Vav Hey, Hitzavti Behamadati Vriti Beni Benehem. Hitzavti, I made stand, like Tem Nitzavim, the parsha we just had a few weeks ago, but this is in the Hefil. I caused to stand, and now a synonym Behamadati, and I caused to. So maybe I caused to be present and real. Hitzavti, I caused to stand. V'amarti vriti ve'ni ubenehem. The covenant I made between me and with them. I think the impact of this Rashi is saying, now that Rashi has gone to pains to describe the previous verses as saying that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not get Yud Hey Vav Hey impact, but quote unquote just El Shaddai impact, and just El Shaddai impact when God was making a promise to them. Don't think that wasn't a real promise. Don't think that it was like I was revealing myself to them in order to be slippery, in order to not have to fulfill my promise. Yeah, they didn't get what you're getting Yud Hey Vav Hey, but I made a promise to them, and here I am ready to fulfill it. Even a partial revelation from El Shaddai should stand as it would for Yud Hey Vav Hey. Let's get a microphone going around for Larry.
Could almost be like when a new administration takes over, or when a country maybe is changed in some way, taken over by another country, they're announcing the treaties that I have previously made, I'm still beholden to. So you shouldn't worry that just because I'm now the king, that I'm not going to follow through with all the promises made by the previous monarch, or the previous regime, or the previous country.
Yeah, it's sort of the inverse of that, because here what's shifting is not the monarch in power, but the monarch in power saying, I was not as intimate with them as I am with you, but even the promises I made with them count, right? It's as if, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the modern analog. It's similar to that, but God hasn't changed. God is saying, again, through Rashi, though to you, Moshe, I'm Yud Hey Vav Hey, in the real way, and to them I wasn't, when I said, using El Shaddai, that you're going to get the land of Canaan, I meant it. And here I am fulfilling that promise. And he's not quoting the Torah here explicitly, but the last word of the next verse, Va'ezkor et briti, and I have remembered my covenant. Remember, ezkor looks like it's a future verb, but it's past. I remembered my covenant. I remembered that I made a promise to them. And I made a promise to them that I'm prepared to fulfill, even though they got 70% of God's intimacy, not 100% of God's intimacy. Okay? So, we're good so far? I'm just comparing the two different versions of Rashi here. Right. Okay. So that goes right into the next Rashi, which is the second Rashi on verse 4. Leonard, do you want to read? Bill, I'm sorry, I don't have a text. I don't have a text to share with you. Are you okay? You okay? Okay. Okay. We're outdoors. It's light. So now this is the second comment of Rashi on verse 4. Latate. Let's give him the microphone so that people on Zoom can hear it. Correct. So you can read through the Rashi had said, Hitzavti v'marati v'iti v'ni v'nehem. I have. It's actually punctuated two different ways depending on which version of Rashi. In the Torah Chaim, it's considered the end of the first comment. In this version of Rashi, which I also read from, it's considered the beginning of the next comment. But you could read through. I have made present, and I have stood up my covenant between me and between them. Latate lehem. Can you move the microphone because they can't hear unless you're
Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah, please, or just say what you said again.
I can't see it when you put it in front of my eyes. Okay. All right. Vatei lahem et eretz Canaan la'Avraham befarashat milah. Ne'amar ani El Shaddai v'gomer. V'natati lecha v'lazarecha acharecha et eretz megorecha. Yitzchak.
Okay, so pause right there.
Okay.
So what's Rashi doing? Rashi has just said that even though they got El Shaddai, I made them a promise and now I'm going to fulfill it. The next thing that Rashi is doing is what?
It's showing you the promises.
Showing you the promises. To those who are present, I don't have the screen out, so I can't pull up the verses. And to those who are on Zoom, that's also the case. So normally, you know that we actually look directly in Safari at the verses that Rashi quotes. The tech didn't get all the way set up today. So we're just going to read it inside Rashi. Most of what you need is inside Rashi. So, La'Avraham, where did I reveal myself to God, to Abraham with El Shaddai, with some kind of a promise about inheriting a land? Befarshat Milah. So translate that.
So in the Parsha dealing with circumcision.
Right, which is Parshat Lech Lecha, chapter 17. This is chapter 17 of Breshit. And what Rashi is about to do is kind of a abbreviation of several different verses, just the ones that relate to the concept. Ani El Shaddai.
Yeah, so I am El Shaddai. I have given to you and to your seed after you.
Good. And amongst the parts of those verses that Rashi doesn't quote, remember that when Rashi quotes a verse, this is kind of, it may or may not sound strange. Rashi assumes that once he starts quoting a verse, we can fill it off in our heads because everything was oral and memorized. So Rashi is doing us the favor of telling us where, but as soon as Rashi starts quoting a verse and giving us a ... he thinks we're filling all that in our heads. We don't have to see it written, which means he doesn't always quote the part of the verse, or let's say it this way, the part of the verse that appears in Rashi's text is not always all of the part of the verse that's relevant as a proof text. And so in addition to what you actually see on the page, you have the phrase "v'hakimoti et briti," the more explicit part. I will establish my covenant, beini u'veinecha, between me and you. And at the phrase "eretz megurecha," the land of your wanderings, the rest of that pasuk is "et kol eretz Canaan," to make it clear, the land of Canaan. So with Abraham, we've got an El Shaddai, we've got a promise. That's one. Keep going.
Okay, let's talk about Yitzchak. So Yitzchak.
This is chapter 26 of Breshit, verse 3.
Ki lecha u'lezarecha eten et kol ha'aretz v'hakimoti et hashva asher nishbati la'aretz.
Okay.
Right.
What does that verse say?
To you and your all of these lands have established oath. I have fulfilled, I guess, an oath that I swore to Abraham.
Okay, be Rashi on Rashi. What's missing from this proof text? What needs to be in this proof text for it to be a good proof text, and it's not there? Because these Rashi is going back into Breshit to create a linkage between God's appearing to the Israelites as El Shaddai and the promise of the land of Israel. El Shaddai is not here, right? So El Shaddai was with Abraham. We'll see in a second that El Shaddai is going to be with Yaakov. How does Rashi resolve the Rashi on the Rashi? Because Rashi knows that we're smart, and he knows that we're going to pick up on the fact that El Shaddai is missing from this phrase. V'ota
ואותה השבועה
Hold on a second. Barbara and Rick and Joanna, can you hear Leonard? You can? Okay, good.
אוקיי, ואותה שבועה שנשבעתי לאברהם באל שדי, אמרתי ליעקב.
Amarti lo, or Amarti. Put a period after Amarti.
Oh, אמרתי.
So Rashi says, yeah, I know. In this quote about Yitzchak, there's no reference to El Shaddai, but it's the same promise. Yeah, that it was the same promise, Shenishbati Abraham, that I promised to Abraham, El Shaddai Amarti lo. El Shaddai Amarti. I said it in the kind of the personality of El Shaddai when I spoke to Yitzchak, even though it's not there. This is a version of why I can't believe Matt's not here to hear the joke again. Why we know that Yaakov wore a kippah, because it says Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheba, Jacob left Beersheba. And would he possibly have left Beersheba without wearing a kippah? Obviously not. So how do we know that El Shaddai is here? Because of course he said it as El Shaddai. So he's not able to give an explicit proof text. And Yaakov.
Just wanted to point out that neither Safaria nor our book puts a.
Well, our book puts a comma after. Hold on. Yeah, that's. With great respect to the editors of the Torah Chaim, there's got to be a comma or a period after Amarti, because you've got Avraham and then Yitzchak and then Yaakov. So the Yaakov is beginning a next phrase. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Yaakov, El Shaddai.
This is definitely an eats, shoots, and leaves thing, right? That if you, without the period or some kind of a separation there, then you read through into Yaakov, and his Rashi's own defense of what's missing in the previous proof text stops making sense. So there's got to be something there. Go ahead. Okay. Now, just with that quote, that doesn't help us. But again, Rashi assumes that we know the whole verse. I'm going to read to you the continuation of the verse from this other version of Rashi I have. On that verse from chapter 35 of Reshit, Ani El Shaddai, I am El Shaddai, pray urve, be fruitful, multiply, etc. Et haaretz asher. Did you have that?
Yeah.
Et haaretz asher v'gomer. What's the next of the verse? Asher natati la'Avraham li'Yitzchak, the same land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, lecha et nana, I'm going to give to you, ulazaracha, and to your offspring, acharecha, after you, etain et haaretz, etc. v'gomer. Okay, so now we've got two explicit references for Avraham and Yaakov of El Shaddai and a promise. We have a promise with regard to Yitzchak, but not the El Shaddai. But Rashi says, don't worry, it was implied. And with all of these, hare,
shenadarti lahem velo kiyamti.
Meaning?
I promised them, but I didn't fulfill it.
Right. So now's the time, right? The loan is due, right? The loan is due. What's interesting about Rashi's take on this, which I guess you could pull out of Pshat as well, but Rashi emphasizes it. It's almost as if Rashi is imagining a God who's more interested in fulfilling a contract than responding to suffering, right? The Pshat reads that finally the groanings of the Israelites rose up to God, and God, in God's compassion, came down and said, I need to rescue them. By stringing this through, Rashi is basically saying, yeah, the suffering reminded God, but what to remind God? I have a bill to pay. I'm holding a petek, and I haven't fully paid off this loan. I better get down there and do it. As if the suffering was an initiator, but not the primary reason that God is an actor in this scene, right? And if I'm reading Rashi correctly, right, I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that, right? Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's modeling a God who, no matter how long a promise is forgotten, it's going to be remembered. Or maybe it's trying to soften the notion that God is responding directly to pain, because if God is responding directly to pain, why isn't God always responding directly to pain? Leonard?
I'd say that she was living, in the Crusades, and all kinds of things were going on, and faith that God keeps his promise.
Yeah, that's a nice historical possibility. This reminds me of a joke my grandfather used to tell. I'm gonna butcher it, but a guy is cleaning out his house, and he sees a receipt for a pair of shoes that he sent in to fix at the cobbler 9 years ago, and the cobbler's still in business. So he decides to go into the cobbler and says, "Hey, I don't know if you remember this, but I dropped off shoes 9 years ago, forgot to pick them up. Can I pick them up? And the Kalba says, yeah, they'll be ready next Tuesday, right? Thanks for reminding me. And now I got it right. So it's like God says, oh, you're right. I did promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, let's get down to it, right? So that's where the Rashi's on verse 4 ends. Any comments or questions on the table or on Zoom? Rosemary, let's get a microphone there. Can we get the microphone to Rosemary?
I don't know if God forgot it. It wasn't forgotten.
Right. And if you remember, there are parts of the Haggadah, we think we referenced this last time, that don't get a lot of attention, a lot of Siddharim, where there's a whole numerology game played through verses from early in Breshit discussing how long the expected enslavement in Egypt is supposed to be. But this notion, and Rashi is going to make reference to it explicitly soon, that somehow as early as Breshit, God knew and God foresaw that the Israelites would be enslaved in Egypt for a certain period of time. That's also a weird thing to think about, that it was horrific lingering in Egypt was known and couldn't have been avoided. It was part of the process of redemption. And now God is saying, you've reminded me. You reminded me it's time for me to come down and do something about it. Stevie. Okay, we definitely need 2 microphones next time in addition to mine. So you don't have to go back.
Just that Pasuk 4 is really about the past, and Pasuk 5 is where he says, that like, now I'm going to do it. So, and it is a response to Shemati at Nakat. So I don't think Rashi is doing anything different than the text itself is doing.
You might be right. Yeah, I'm having a reaction to Rashi, which may or may not be fully plain. Even in verse 5, right? The shot of verse 5 is, I've heard the groaning and I've remembered my covenant. To me, this is just a personal reaction. The emphasis seems to be the suffering and therefore my realizing that I owe this people something. Rashi's extended treatment of verse 4 seems to suggest that it's what I owed them is more significant to this God in this moment than what I owe this people now. But one does not have to read it that way.
I haven't looked at the Rashi on verse 5 yet, but nothing in the Rashi so far has seemed to say like I would do anything differently now than the status quo.
Yeah.
Right. It's just that like, oh, this is the backstory.
Fair. With that in mind, why don't you read the Rashi on verse 5 and let's see if we get there.
The Gamani, Moshe, Kitzavti, Vehemati, Havrit, Yesh Alai Lakayam. So as I stand, the covenant, it's incumbent on me, I guess, to fulfill.
Good.
Lefichach, Shemati et Nakhat b'nei Israel, Hano Akim. So therefore, now that I've heard the moans of the Israelites, which are the just moans again, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure why Rashi needs to add the present tense Hanoakim, as if we didn't know what Na'aka was, the gerund of a groaning, I don't know how Noakim would help us. Maybe he's just trying to like string it all, like connect 2 parts of the pasuk as a sentence. Shamati et nakat b'nei Yisrael hanoakim asher like keeping the plural. Asher he mitzrayim avidim otam. I don't know. I don't know.
It's your mouth.
If that noakim is necessary. I see Joanna saying, keep going.
So, which Egypt enslaved them, and I remember.
I would say Egypt enslaved them. Oh, Leonard, are you still? I mean, Larry. I'm getting an echo.
It's my fault.
Yeah. So the groanings due to the fact that the Egyptians were enslaving them, comma, va'eskor.
Right. Oto habrit, this is the covenant. Ki vivrit bein habitarim amarti lo begam etagoy asher yavodu dananochi. Because in the covenant between the pieces in Breshit 15, I said to Abraham and also his nation will serve, that they will serve, I will judge.
Right, and this is going back to what I said to you before, Rosemary, that in the first moment that God reveals God's self to Abraham in the Brit Ben Abitarim, where he's splitting up the animal, the birds, and he's walking between them. There's a verse in that section that says, Gam et hagoy asher ya'avodu, the nation that the Israelites will serve in the future, Dan Anochi, I will judge, and that seems to be a reference to the future enslavement in Egypt, and I am going to come down and
right, and it's also,
them.
I think that's the beginning of and then I will take them out with great wealth, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
correct.
So no, but the continuation of the quote would be, and then I will take them out, which is not present in the Rashi, at least in my version. But right. I think part of the import of the verse.
Correct. Another situation where Rashi assumes that if Rashi quotes a verse, then we'll know the end. By the way, you know how sometimes we're not sure if the diburei hamatchil, the words in our section that are bolded, that are words from the verse that Rashi is commenting on, are original to Rashi, that might be a later editor. It's also the case that the words of the verse that Rashi brings as a proof text may or may not have been the exact words from that verse that Rashi quoted. That may be something that editors handled later. Okay, so Stevie, now that you read the Rashi on verse 5, any other thoughts on what the emphasis is or what the connections are between Rashi's comments on verse 4 and 5?
Digest it a little bit, but yeah, he certainly is more rooted in the past than I gave him credit for.
Yeah, to me, and again, I'm not going to die on this hill. Even Rashi putting the word lefichach here seems to be a sermon, right? So just as I made present hitzativ and made stand that covenant, I've got to fulfill it. And since I have to fulfill it, lefichach, therefore, I listened to the suffering, as if the suffering was an awakening of my obligation, my bond, not that the reason why I listened to the suffering is because I listened to suffering, right? There's a different sermon one could give, right? Why am I listening to the suffering of the Israelites? Because they're suffering. No, I realized I'm listening to the suffering because I haven't fulfilled my obligation that I committed all those centuries ago. Joanna's hand was up. Is it still up, Joanna?
I mean, I had a comment back on verse 4 that Eretz Canaan seems to be referenced 3 times.
Joanna, can you speak a little bit louder, because we're outdoors and we want to hear everything you say, and there's a fire engine going by.
I have a comment back on verse 4, which is, why is Eretz Canaan referenced 3 times? Eretz Canaan, et Eretz Megurehem, Asher Garuva, and especially the last 2. Eretz, like, we don't know that Eretz Megurehem would be a land Asher Garuva. And by now, isn't even Eretz Canaan enough? Like, we've had enough references to Canaan that we know what that land is and what's happened there so far. Why do we need this overly explicit explanation 3 times to be told what land we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, that brings me back to the conversation that we had probably the last time we met, which was when we were working on the pshat of verse 4 before we looked at the Rashi. We discussed some version of that, particularly the apparent redundancy of Megurehem Asher Garuva. Right? Now that is a biblical thing, a Hebrew thing, that sometimes you have the verb and the object of the verb from the same root, and it sounds lyrical to say it, and it happens less frequently in English because roots don't operate in the same way, right? We don't often talk about, I don't know, there's not as many situations where you have both sides of a phrase being from the same root. It does seem to be extraneous. Like if it's Eretz Megurehem, obviously they were Garud Ba. And if they'd Garud Ba there, obviously it's Eretz Megurehem. And I remember there were some interesting possible resolutions to that when we discussed a few weeks ago. I don't remember exactly what they were. And yes, the reference to that land that they're no longer in, that nearly all of the Sefer Bereshit took place in, and which they're not going to go back to until when? Until the end of the Torah. Someone just. He's back, right? It is clearly emphasized here very loudly. Barbara, and then Larry, and then Barry. Let's get a microphone over to them in advance. Barbara.
Yeah, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I just was wondering, because Rosemary mentioned the amount of time that they were down in Egypt. We know that
Hold on one second. I'm going to turn the volume up.
It's my understanding that the Jews were in Egypt for 400 years. But what I'm suddenly kind of curious about is how long is the period of time going to be from this through the time that the Hebrews left Egypt?
Okay, so Barbara's saying that her understanding is that the time of the Israelites were in Egypt were 400 years, and she wants to know how much time between now and Exodus night. Okay, so first of all, there are several different countings within rabbinic tradition that, discussing how long the Israelites were in Egypt. They're colloquially, we sometimes refer to it as 400. Sometimes the internal math of the Torah is counted in the 200s, and there's that section in the Haggadah that deals with that numerology, but there's no one answer to that question. Your real question is, how long do the 10 plagues last, right? Because Moshe is about to have an encounter with Pharaoh, and then we're kind of on a non-stop cycle of 10 plagues until Exodus night. And that cycle, which takes us through all of Parshat Va'era, the beginning of Parshat Bo, does not have a lot of timestamps on it, right? Sometimes we have timestamps in the Torah, sometimes we do not. We have no obvious proof within the text of the Torah of how much time there was between Dam and Sfardea, between Sfardea and Kinim. Was this a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months? We don't know. The counting that is concrete, even within the lodge of the Torah, does not happen until Exodus night. So I have no good answer to that question, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Larry?
So you can stop me if this is not appropriate to this conversation I was trying to hear as I was watching Millie. So I'm going way back to chapter 5.
That is wildly inappropriate, Larry. I can't believe you'd bring that up.
I'm trying to understand the arc of this story, and it seems to me that this is the conversation that Moses should have had with God at the burning bush, and not now. So I'm wondering if maybe the story hasn't been pieced together, and what's really happened here is when Moses has interjected himself into the situation. If you recall, the Israelites said, "What are you doing here? You're making things worse. Who are you?" And he is trying to establish the validity of why this guy who has come, and bear with me for a moment, maybe not from Egypt at all, but from the land of Canaan, where he claims that this God had made a deal with his ancestors, and now this deal is also applicable to these Hebrews who are here.
Mm-hmm.
So the conversation is, I'm perhaps understanding it, isn't really between God and Moses, but rather between Moses and the Israelites, saying, my God that I'm coming is actually your God, and the promise that he made to me way over there, or to my ancestors way over there, way back then, is applicable to you.
Yeah. Lovely. Read the first 3 words of verse 6.
Of verse 6 in Hebrew?
Yeah.
Hold on. Lechen emor livnei Yisrael.
Right. So what's coming, right, is what I, God, have just said to you, Moshe. Why am I saying it to you? So that when you stand in front of the Israelites, you can connect for them what I'm presenting now and the stories that they've inherited from their ancestors.
And for some people, I think could be rather disturbing because it can disconnect completely Bereshit from Shemot.
Yeah. Nice. Barry?
So I my take on this is Shaddai to Abraham and Yitzhak and Yaakov. It's like God setting up in God's future an alarm clock. So it's not an intentionality. It's just it's an alarm clock placed out there in the future that God knows. So now the alarm clock goes, and it's time for action. I don't see into here the groaning causing anything. The groaning is supposed to happen at this time in the alarm setup. and that's it's basically it's a response to something that's had been set up previously. We spoke about the numerology and the number of years is supposed to transpire. So those number of years have transpired, and now it's time for the action.
Yeah, I think the alarm clock imagery is a useful one, right? To me, to use the alarm clock imagery reinforces to me the point that I was making when I talked to Stevie, that what seems to be important to God here through Rashi's eyes, and it's only Rashi we're studying, is the alarm clock going off reminding me of what I owed then, as opposed to what's present in this moment, which is, let's play the game, hundreds of thousands of Israelites suffering, right? Yeah. Stevie, let's get that microphone over there again. Yeah, just throw it. He'll catch it.
In this chair.
You know, we finally got the logistics and the tech kind of okay in Pilch with the hybrid to do that outdoors with the ECC around us. It's wonderful to study in the Sukkah, but it's like we can't leave well enough alone. We have to make things more complicated. Go ahead, Stevie.
Yeah, I think that in this case, it actually depends very heavily on whether the Kuntras Rashi itself included those quotations from the pasuk or not, because without them, he says, right? I had this promise that I hadn't fulfilled. And then Kamosha, whatever, says that again. Right? Therefore, the moaners are the covenant. Right? Like, and it's kind of ambiguous as to what that means exactly. But the way it's partitioned here, there's a separation between Vigamani and then Shemati, which is like as egregious a separation as, right, Anochi Esav Bechorcha, right? Like it's like it completely destroys any possibility that the Shemati is the key thing. But it's not totally clear to me that that was Rashi, or if that's just the way that Rashi appears now.
It's a really great comment, Stevie, and kind of unwittingly, we've uncovered really something very fascinating, which is, you know, I think I've shared you before that there are indeed masters and PhD theses done on the grammar of Rashi and which parts of what appear in our versions of Rashi were original to him. And sometimes it really is the case that what is quoted and how it's punctuated changes our impression of Rashi's sermon on the verse. That's a helpful reminder, right? We are reading Rashi just as a explicator of the verse. Every few weeks and months, I remind you, Rashi is writing sermons, right? He's writing sermons through Perush HaMikra, right? The interpretation of the verses, but he's trying to say something of substance about God or Israel or his condition, and therefore the precise emphasis that he has or lacks is everything, right? In the same way that if you took any one of my sermons and punctuated differently or even emphasized the word differently, that would change the tone and what I was trying to push through in the idea. Great. Okay. Thank you for that, Stevie. Let's go to verse 6, because there was only one Rashi in verse 5 when we read it. Rosemary?
Just thinking of the text, I was thinking, in a way, this is proving that one tzaddik is much more important than 100 people are crying.
Yeah.
Because God reminds us that because of Abraham and Yaakov, he's going to do.
Yeah. So, Rosemary, you just put into words some of what I find this part of Rashi not to be bad, but uncomfortable, right? It does seem to be preferencing, right, God's promise to those three tzaddikim over the experience of the current Israelites. Not that he's going to redeem these Israelites, but God's going to redeem the Israelites out of a bond due to them, right? So you can imagine that could also be a sermon, right? Like, look how significant the promise of or from a righteous person is. It can awaken even God's memory. But I don't know. The sermon I would want to write about this is God hears cries, right? God, when you're in pain and distress, the God of the Torah is listening. No, is that true? I don't know, but that's the sermon I'd want to hear or give depending on the situation. Okay, let's go to verse 6. Barry, do you want to read verse 6? Let's get Barry the microphone. Barry, put the microphone maybe about 8 inches from your mouth is my suggestion.
Lakein emor lifnei Yisrael ani Adonai. V'chotzeti etem hitachad asivlot Mitzrayim. V'hitzalti etchem me'avodatam. V'ga'alti etchem b'zrua d'tviyah u'vishvatim gedolim.
Okay, and as Barry is translating, I want everyone to count the past tense verbs in this verse.
Therefore say to the Ben Israel, I am Adonai. I will bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt, and I will save you from their slavery. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with acts of great judgments.
Right, and I spoke, when I said that before, I made a Freudian slip because these verbs look like past tense. What I meant was future tense because they're vav hipuch. How many of those future tense verbs that look like past tense verbs are there in this verse? We've got v'hotzeti.
It's the vav that does it, right? V'chotzeti, that turns it into.
Correct.
What's that?
So how many do we have in this verse?
Okay, there's one. V'chotzeti. V'hitzalti is v'ka'alti is the third one.
Right. So that's 3 so far. What's the first word of the next pasuk, Barry?
I'm sorry, what?
The first word of the next verse is what?
V'lachachti.
That's 4, right?
4. Yeah.
Ringing a bell for anybody?
And then we go on to Vidatem.
So, but the 4 future tense verbs, v'hotzeti, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti, is that ringing any kind of a ritual bell, Stevie? Right. The four cups of wine on Pesach, and the reason why the 4 is an iconic number on Pesach, it's hard to know what's the chicken, what's the egg, is linked to these 4 lishonot, the 4 languages of redemption that span 2 verses in this section of Parshat Va'era, right? They're all sort of synonyms. Well, not quite synonyms. They're all talking about the same process. V'hotzeti, to take out, right? Hitzalti, to save. Ga'alti, redeem. Lakachti, to take. And if we just read a few more words into verse 7, you've got v'lakachti, and that's normally where the number 4 ends. But a few words after verse 7, v'lakachti etchem li la'am, I will take you to be as a nation, v'hayiti lachem Elohim, and I will be to you as a God. So there's actually a 5th, and if you look at the beginning of verse 8, there's in a 6th, v'heveti, and I will bring you, right? So one of the things that are said about this is, first of all, note that of the 4 original languages of redemption, the 4th one is lakachti, I will take you to be my people. When does God take the Jewish people to be God's people in the story? When's the marriage? Sinai. And lakachti is marriage language. Vayikach ish isha, when a man takes a woman as a wife. And this is taught all the time as a reminder that the purpose of Exodus was not just to be out of slavery. The purpose of Exodus was to marry God at Mount Sinai. You didn't get liberated to be liberated. You got liberated to be recommitted to God, to a relationship with God, to a benevolent master as opposed to a malevolent master. And then, as Stevie mentioned before, that not everyone heard, and then there's this notion that part of this is also bringing us the land of Israel, and then an eventual promise that Elijah will come and bring peace to everybody. So the fact that that 4 is, and this is why it's hard to know what's the chicken and what's the egg. If it was obvious that there were just 4 verbs, then the notion that the 4 cups of wine on Pesach are connected to these 4 verbs, we can imagine it really went organically that way. That the rabbis were looking at the verse, hey, 4 verbs, let's do 4 cups. But the fact that it's actually 4 amongst 5 or 4 amongst 6 or 4 amongst 7, when you count, it makes us wonder maybe the 4 was a part of the Seder experience, and then they graphed that afterwards onto 4 of several verbs. Steve, let's get Stevie a microphone. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It's just so.
I know.
It wasn't really clear to the Israelites that this was a conditional getting out of Egypt. It had the appearance of we're going to get out of jail. Period. But that wasn't it.
Good. For those of you on Zoom who can't hear, we're on the field, and the wonderful Crespin Early Childhood Center with about 80 toddlers are out there singing, which is wonderful, but it's making it a little bit hard to focus here. Yeah. We're almost done. Let me get Rick and then Stevie. Rick, unmute and speak loud.
Hi.
Speak louder.
Hi.
Speak louder. It's hard to hear you.
Okay. Two things. Can you hear me? Two things.
But if you can speak even a little bit louder, that'd be great.
The Vegams, I remember that when it was Gam this and Gam that there was additional meaning to it, taking away from it if you said something and then Gam this and then Gam that. So I just wanted to ask you about that. I'm noticing 4 starts with a Vegam and 5 starts with a Vegam. So I wanted to ask you about that. The other thing was I wanted your take more on whether the people wouldn't have been rescued if they hadn't been groaning, and how much groaning do they need to do before God steps in? If they were happy being slaves, then God was waiting for them to be upset about it. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I heard only a little piece of that, Rick, because it's loud on the field, and I just couldn't hear your voice. I think you were asking about the progression of the Vagams in verse 4 and verse 5, and then whether or not something about the groaning, but I didn't really quite hear the question.
Well, I just want you to make more clear whether God is waiting for them to be upset about slavery before he does anything. I thought there was, I'm not happy with the trigger of how long he's waiting to get us out of slavery.
Right. So however long the Israelites have been enslaved by Egypt, it wasn't yesterday. It wasn't a week ago. It wasn't a month ago. It wasn't a year ago. It wasn't a decade ago. It wasn't a generation ago, right? But something happens when like, who's the initial reactor to the Israelites' suffering? Moses. And then Moses' experience in the desert in Midian, and then Moses' experience in the burning bush. So somehow God's conscience that is moving God to redeem the Israelites in our scene is awakened by Moshe's conscience, which means that God's conscience was not awakened by days, weeks, months, years, decades, and generations of Israelite suffering. But now God's conscience is. But to me, that's a problematic gap. It is. Yeah. Stevie, you'll get the last comment. Then I have one logistic announcement before we close up.
Yeah. Just interesting that this, possibly in contrast to chapter 4, I didn't check yet, but that there's Moses is, and this is building on what Barry said, is not told to tell the Israelites anything about this God being the God of their ancestors. Like, as far as they know, it's a new God. Like, all that matters is he's the God of rescue. It's like for the people.
Yeah.
Right? Moses, like, it's important for Moses to know that God has this covenant and whatever, but like for the people, it's not told at all.
Let's hold that thought till we get to verse 8, right, which we'll read closely in a few weeks, because as part of those extra verbs beyond the 4, verse 8, right? So there is, within the quotation marks that God is telling Moshe to tell the Israelites, there is a reference to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not in the same detail that God has just said to Moshe. But remember what Larry said before, are we supposed to understand that what God is telling Moshe through verse 5, Moshe is supposed to repeat to the Israelites, or is it just for Moshe's sake? And we don't know.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.